Lights. You can't smell it. You can't see it. You can't hear it. You can't taste it. But over 20% of us, if not more these days, are sensitive to the emissions that are around us. You're actually looking in real time at transmissions that are around this building, flooding this room. You don't even realize it, but it's here. You're looking at a simulation, it's real time, and it's showing you what's in our environment, and you don't even know it's there. So, my name is Dan Debaun. I grew up on Long Island. I worked in the aerospace industry early on in my career. And I realized on Long Island, aerospace was dimming a bit. So I found another career in telecommunications. As Steve was mentioning, I went into the development organization first, and then ultimately I developed the standards and analyzed technology for the industry, the Bell system, for years and years and years. So I had a lot of experience with the technology that we had in our environment today. And by the way, I never thought about it, but our environment that I was testing was electronics against electronics, not electronics against humans. I never, ever tested for electronics against humans. Fast forward to today, about 7 years ago or so, I had my sons visiting, they're adult men, and they had their laptops on their lap. My wife says to me, I want grandchildren, and that laptop on the lap can't be good for my son. And I said, and then she says, I want grandchildren. And so I said, the power levels of the electronics around us cannot be damaging. We don't have to worry about anything. It is harmless to our children. But I said, well, let me take a quick look and see if that's true or not. And so I began reading some of the research at the time, and I found that even at that time, over 25% of the male sperm is immobile after 3 or 4 hours of exposure in the lab. And as some of you may know, over the last 10 years, 50% of the male capacity to abort children is dropped by 50%. A coincidence or not, I don't know. And so a few years, and at the same time, I also found a research study out of Italy, and it said that the female womb is also affected by emissions. The emissions were, I'm going to go on this side so I don't get hit from that side, by the way, if you were here before. So I found that 2%, they had a large population of females that they studied, and they found that 2% had a tumor. Of that group, a small percentage were cancerous. So we got more and more involved, my son and I, and we decided there was so much information on the research side that nobody knew about, including me, that was in the middle electronics for years and years and years. So that gap was because somehow all that research was not becoming available to us. And so my son and I decided, let's write a book. Maybe tell everybody what it is, maybe understand what we knew about in the research and things we can do. So today, what I'm hoping to do is give you a definition of what electromagnetic radiation is, and from there we'll talk about what the standards are and what we know about the testing that's occurred, and then maybe a little bit what we can do in our own lives to minimize or mitigate those emissions that could affect our body. After that, I'm going to talk a little bit about 5G, because anybody who talks about electromagnetic radiation today has to talk about 5G. Most people don't understand the real problems with 5G, and I hope to share enough where we all can sort of look at it. What do we want to worry about, and what do we don't need to worry about? hopefully we'll get a pattern of understanding of those things. So let's move on to the next chart. It's very controversial. When we got involved, you had the industry that's providing the services to us that's saying there's literally no concerns. There's no problems at all. And then we had the researchers, the preponderance of researchers, saying there is a problem. There's direct links to many of the problems we have in our daily lives with our bodies. So what I'm speaking about today is controversial. Can it harm you? Are you safe? Is there things you can do to be safe? Or are you not? And I put a little cartoon there, sort of hedging my bet a little bit. That's a lot of money being made. The industry's making a whole bunch of money. So in our environment, we have very powerful points of view that become public. And quite honestly, the researchers don't seem to have the same similar power as some of the influences in the marketplace as the service providers have. Why today? Why is it important to understand it today? When I had a cell phone 25 years ago, I would call my friends, but of course none of my friends had a cell phone. So when I used it, I didn't use it very much. Most of us didn't have cell phones, so we never really got exposed to much. If you look today, however, over the last 10 years or so, all of us have cell phones. Even our kids have cell phones. We have laptops, we have tablets, we have so many things that are in our environment that is now contributing to the ambient, in where we are, the buildings we're in, and that is far substantially greater than the exposures 10 years ago. So why now? It's become a problem that's in our front door, in our room, in our homes. We're going to talk a little bit about that some more. This is one of these charts I use, and there's a test after this, by the way. Electromagnetic radiation it's a power. You can't see it, but there's a powerful image, a signal that's hitting your body, and it's that constant barrage of that and the many sources of that are potentially creating the problem we just spoke about. But let me start by saying what's some fundamental definition of it. If you look to the right in the middle, I have a wave. That's a hertz. That's one cycle in 1 second. That's what a hertz is. And everything you hear about today is relative to hertz. What's the speed of the signal that you're being hit with? It's a hertz. It's one. If you go to the beach and you watch a wave, and another one comes in a second later, that's a hertz. So when you think about the spectrum, you begin thinking about from very, very low hertz, which is known as non-ionizing radiation, to ionized radiation, which is really, really, really fast. What do I mean by that? In your house, you have either a 100 amp or 200 amp service. It's alternating current at 60 cycle. That's 60 hertz. So when we talk about some potential areas where there's a source of emissions, we talk about the stuff in the wall. When there's any electronics on, your motor in your refrigerator, your hair dryer that you're drying your hair with, all of those things are generating electromagnetic radiation, but it's at 60 hertz. So that's one form of electronics that we find in our environment today. And then we have the radio frequency stuff. And the radio frequency stuff is the cell phones, the tablets, the microwave ovens, the 5G. It's just a faster transmission. we said hertz. When we talk about cell phones, we talk about 1 gigahertz. That's 1 billion cycles per second. When we talk about 5G, we talk about gigahertz, up to 300 billion cycles in 1 second. So all of a sudden, we have these emissions that are starting low on our radio signal. They're going faster and faster and faster and faster and faster. That is the issue in 5G that you hear in the media today. We're going into realms we haven't been in, and we know very little about as we increase the speeds. Now, ionized radiation, which is the X-ray, everyone knows probably in here that it can be dangerous. Well, what is it that actually makes it dangerous? And I'm going to talk a little bit about the difference between ionized and non-ionized and how they affect the cell very differently, but both are harmful. So, ionized radiation, at the very top of the chart, you see I'm calling out the electron. That's a rotating negative charge around an ion. That charge, when you have an electromagnetic radiation hit the cell, what it does is smashes the ionized part of the cell, and it charges it. By the way, ionized means charged. It becomes a positive charge. And the net result of that is that the cell is instantly damaged. There's enough power that's moving that electron out of its orbit to create a condition where you have DNA damaged cells or mutated cells. So when you are getting your teeth tested, they give you an X-ray. And the way it works is they put it in your mouth, they run out into the back, they put this heavy lead thing on you, and they run out in the back, and they push this button, it goes zzz, and then it turns, and then they come back and see if you're still there. That's why. Non-ionizing radiation. This is where a lot of the battle occurs. With non-ionizing radiation, what's the impact to the cell? What's the impact to our bodies? It also creates mutated cells, DNA damaged cells, but it's in a very different way. When you talk about the power level of EMF, you're talking about its influence of the cell membrane. As you can see in the chart, EMF is hitting the cell of the membrane. It keeps on hitting it and hitting it and hitting it and hitting it. Eventually, that cell says, I give up. And then there's calcium that ends up penetrating into the cell. Then there's a chemical reaction within the cell because of that deluge of calcium. And what happens then is nitric oxide builds out. And that's actually, that chemical process is what's breaking down the cell. And by the way, like the previous chart, it mutates the cell and DNA damages the cell. It's just a different way of doing it. But they make no doubt about it, you still have a tumor as a result of that in time if you don't watch the use of your technologies. What's important about this chart is we now know what the breakdown of the cell is. We know the mechanics of a cell. We know that there is potential for serious impact to the body as a result of it. But what's dwarfed is the impact to the body processes we have. Our body's reacting to a signal that has never existed in its life. In fact, if you look 100 years ago, there was literally no EMF in our environment. It's quintuple exposure today in our current environment. And our bodies, all of our bodies, reacting to it slightly differently. And so what you're hearing about is I don't feel well, I had a headache, my eyes hurt. those are legitimate body responses to the exposures in your environment. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the fact that I don't worry about the cell breaking down. I worry about the impact to the human and our quality of life. There's more appearance of fairly exponential change in the way our bodies are responding. Our bodies still don't know how to deal with this, but we are now getting an understanding that we haven't had ever. So I'm going to reiterate a little bit of what I said. You've probably heard on the left-hand side of the chart, this was the only electromagnetic radiation that existed. And look, it was at 5 to 12 hertz, 12 cycles per second. What's also slightly different, it was DC. It doesn't alternate like EMF does that has an AC driver for it. And so this is the point, it never existed in our environment. And all of a sudden, we now have between 0 and 300 hertz, a whole bunch of stuff in our house. We have our vacuum cleaner, our stove, our refrigerator. Everything that's pulling current is emitting emissions on the walls around us, every one. Then we have the radio frequency stuff, as we spoke about in the spectrum. That's between 300 hertz and 300 gigahertz. By the way, the 300 gig is the FCC new defined 5G range, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. But within that space, look at all the devices we have. Our Wi-Fi's, our tablets, our laptops, everything we have around us. And we have refrigerators talking to our tablet application to see if there's milk inside the refrigerator. Do I really need to know I have milk in the refrigerator from a machine talking to another machine and at the same time emitting something in my environment that is detrimental? I won't be able to drink it 10 years from now. So, microwave, at the very bottom, I really like to talk about this as the prelude for the next set of charts I'm going to talk about. And that is your router works at 2.4 gigahertz, 2.4 billion cycles per second. And your microwave is at 2.3 gigahertz. What happens when you put something in the microwave? The water in between the cells heats up, oscillates the cells. They oscillate so quickly, they cook your meat. That's how it works. So when you put a cell phone to your head, you have the identical frequency hitting your head. What is a microwave? It's known as a thermal emitting signal. Thermal. That means at 2.3 gigahertz, science knows when it hits you, it's going to heat you up. So the question is how much? And what long durations do you have to worry about before that happens? And when you use your cell phone, and maybe you, particularly women, I'll tell you that why in a bit. If she said it's hot, my skin is getting hot, her meat's cooking. It's literally, you feel the energy being absorbed within the body, heating up the water between the cells, and it's oscillating. That's what you're feeling. And we'll talk about that. Okay, what do I mean by our environment is getting completely full of the emissions in our environment? You got to understand what the signal actually is. It's a omnidirectional transmission. What that means is it starts at a source, and it starts building out until it gets to the end of it. A router, for example, probably goes 250 feet, 300 feet. Your same omnidirectional signal from your cell phone goes 4 miles to 5 miles. So it's going a long way when it starts with your cell phone. It's not isolated either, because now you have someone else in the room. They're transmitting to meet the cell tower. Now you have 2 transmissions coming out of your room into some other far-end connection. Nothing is what they call directional. The signals today that we have in our environment are not directional. They're omnidirectional. So when I'm using my cell phone, I am potentially interfering with Kylan over there. You over here. Both of you are seeing my signal. You're being hit with my signal. So it's omnidirectional. You got to remember that, because that's sort of an important discussion as we move on. Okay. When, believe it or not, I actually was around the starting of this stuff. And there were analog signals. An analog signal is a constant load. The way the cell looks at it is a constant load. The way the concrete looks at it is a constant load. If I take an elephant or a 10,000-pound load and I put it on top of a piece of concrete through a steel bar, the concrete won't break, because it's constant load, and because it's constant, the response of the concrete is not to break. All of a sudden, we started 2G and up to 4G so far. We have an analog carrier, and we have a digital signal inside, on, off, on, off, on, off, on, off. It's hitting the cell. It's badgering the cell. The cell says, I can't take it anymore, I'm going to break, and that's how the calcium runs through. It's a different signal. We know from research that there are differences in the way we digitize those signals and the impact it has on our cells. So what makes all of this dangerous, and more dangerous in time, is it's a jackhammer hitting our cell. It's no longer a constant load. That's what makes this a changing game. It's not just the fact, it's the frequency that's increasing, although in between the cases of 2G and 4G, it's all around 1 to 2 gigahertz. We really haven't had introduction of anything beyond that yet. So let's talk about the standards in this space. About 78 or so, the FCC said, we have to make sure we're all protected. And what they did is they said, we got to figure out what's out there in the marketplace that we have to protect. So what they decided to do is go to the Army. They went to the Army and they said, let's take this large group of adult males, typically 6 foot, and let's try to figure out how much heat the thermal transmission would occur. Remember the microwave? How much heat should we allow that area of the head to heat up? Then they said, how far should we let that signal go into the head? How much? They said 2 inches. Thermal. Only thermal. And at the time, as I said before, I had a cell phone. I didn't call anybody because no one else had one. Now, all of a sudden, everyone uses it. So a casual use of a cell phone in 1987 or 86 was 6 minutes. I can't get my son off the phone in 6 hours, no less 6 minutes. All of a sudden, our pattern of use is fundamentally changed. And what's the impact of that? we have a standard that protected a six-foot male. At the end of the day, that's about 3% of the population using cell phones today. Only 6%, 3%. And so when you give a cell phone to a female, when you give a cell phone to a teenager, when you give a cell phone to a child, the penetration is different. And we'll talk a little bit more about it, but the moral of the story is a child, it goes completely through the head, heating up the head. All research and science today in this space that we're worried about is the biological impact, not the thermal impact. The biological impact. That's where research is finding all the interaction between the transmissions in our bodies. It's not the thermal, it's the biological. So for that very reason alone, the SAW rate, the specific absorption rate that has become the standard, really only represents 3% of the population, using it 6 minutes per day, adult male, 6 foot. That's what it represents. And by the way, if you lived in Europe, you're protected twice. The signals, relatively speaking, are half the exposure to European than it is us. We have the highest level of transmission that you can have for a cell phone. I actually had friends of mine who went to the FCC years and years ago who represented the technologies. They were brilliant, brilliant engineers. And people that I personally believe were brilliant engineers. Not one of them was a biochemist. Not one of them was a medical doctor. Not one of them was a researcher. So our standards bodies that created were a bunch of electrical engineers, medical-based experts. So there was never consideration to biological, but it's sort of I understand it because they were engineers. They weren't worried about the body's impact. Another sort of side note about this is the current head of the FCC, he worked in his previous job as counsel for a fairly large service provider. He was an industry expert that went into governance of the industry. His predecessor was the head of a very, very large cellular association, a consortium that represented the interests of the service providers. He actually looked at what the impact was of cell phones way back when with a physician, epidemiologist actually, and he wanted to see if there was a link between cancer. This epidemiologist found a link. That guy ended up losing his sponsorship, epidemiologist, and actually his career disappeared actually. And that guy, who was the chairman, went to the FCC and he approved 5G. So this is not unusual. It turns out that if you look at the pharmaceutical, all the executives that were driving the pharmacy industry became leading the governance of that. It makes some sense because they need to understand what it is they're governing. But on the other hand, they're pretty sided on the views they potentially can represent. And by the way, that's not only in the US. All the governance bodies in Europe that drive the standards have similar kind of incestuous relationship in the marketplace. Goes through the child's head completely. It's thermal and biological. For the first time within the last 10 years, we have children using, without any study on the impacts. So I'm an old guy. I can use a cell phone. If it went through my head, probably wouldn't hit very much. But kids at the earliest age with biological impacts to the head, it's sort of like potentially a serious problem in time. We don't know yet. Why? Because we haven't used it much. I remember watching it was back in the 80s, early 80s, late 70s, about Wi-Fi. No, it was, it was Wi-Fi. And it was smoking. It was smoking. I want to give you a set of mindset at the time. There were a bunch of pediatricians that asked the head of Philip Morris, is there a problem with smoking cigarettes when a woman has a child? And he thought about it a little bit and he said, no, there's no links to any health dangers at all. But he thought about it a little bit more and he said, but the baby's going to be smaller. What woman wouldn't want a smaller baby? That's what he said. It was accepted at the time by the audience, the pediatricians. But think about the mindset. They were destroying a child at birth before he even got out of the womb. And there was that direct correlation to smoking cigarettes that was influencing that child. Of course, we know better now. We know better because they lost in court. That's it. I'm not sure we'd ever known if they hadn't. It's sort of like trans fats. If you think about trans fats, there was this lowly biochemist 30 years ago that said, it's not the eggs we're eating, it's not the fat we're absorbing, it's the trans fats that's clogging our veins. It's not the kind of thing that's when we're eating pure foods. He said it's the trans fats that's doing it. So he said 30 years ago that we shouldn't have it in our food. Guess what? Last year it was banned completely. But over that 30 years, we consumed it. We consumed it for 30 years, and there was casualties along the way, I believe, directly related to the trans fats in our environment. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about science and research and what we know about it. The federal government, 6 years ago or so, funded the National Toxicology Program. It's a division of the federal government. And they were looking to basically justify the standards. And by the way, the federal government hasn't spent much, if any, money outside of this, in this space. And of course, as you know, we were a leader 30 years ago, but we have no scientific research going on today. So when the NTP study came out, it was an epidemiology study in which it was statistically significant. In other words, after the results were met, I could say confidently, by 95% confidence level, that what we found is real. So they had these large populations, transmitters in these epidemiology studies, and they watched over time what would happen. And what they found was there was frontal lobe cancer. There was heart cancer, statistically significant. I'm often asked why there seems to be such a dynamic in the market and such differences of opinion? Well, I'm an engineer, and when I look at something, I look at the statistics. And the only way I could accept the direct link to a human is by taking 10,000 children, lock them in a room, and 10,000 children, and radiate those children against these. And what I'm going to do is watch who dies over that 20-year period from exposures to RF signals. And then I can say definitively, statistically speaking, I can say 95% confidence level that frontal lobe cancer they got is consistent to the whole population. So if you wonder why there's this drama in the marketplace, it's because there's not statistically significant data, but heck of a lot of information we learned. That mega data, the mega study of the studies certainly indicate there's a problem. But here was the first case in a long, long time where we now had statistically significant proof. That was followed up with Ramazzani's study. Ramazzani's in Europe, and actually Italy, they have a consortium of researchers. They did almost identical what they did in the US with the NTP. They found the same thing. They found the frontal lobe and the heart cancers. And so that's like pretty interesting. They found the same results from the same exposures, and the epidemiologies from the same, having the same effects. And so you look at the preponderance of research, that talks about the linkages between body response to RF signals, and there's without a doubt, no question by most who are aware that they're direct links. And if you hear a microbiologist say there's no links, what you know is either they're really, really stupid or they haven't looked at the research. Because if you look at the research, there's a clear preponderance of evidence to talk about the linkages. So the debate about up to 4G is not a debate by most of the science and research community. The National Toxicity Program, part of the government, got sort of not what they hoped for. They got a link, which they didn't want. Let's talk a little bit about the World Health Organization. International governance body on all of the world's health. They classify electromagnetic radiation as a 2B carcinogenic. It's possible that it can cause cancer. It's not probable, it's possible. And so, what does that mean? Well, if you go and have a Wi-Fi in a classroom, it's possible there may be a linkage between the Wi-Fi signal and your kids. It's possible. What are other 2B carcinogenics? Arsenic is a carcinogenic that fits the 2B category. Welding, the smoke from welding is considered a carcinogenic. A volatile organic compound. The fumes from gas or petroleum are considered carcinogenic, possible carcinogenic. So I like to think of it this way. When we have a class and we have a bunch of new students and all the adults are out there and we talk about our classroom and we're going to put Wi-Fi on, we say to the audience, by the way, you know, we have Wi-Fi, and it's exactly the same kind of potential carcinogenic as the welding. So it's like welding all day in the classroom, and all the smoke is going to influence our kids. It's like the gas is going to generate a volatile organic compound, which can potentially bother your kids. And of course, the adults in the room would say, what? You're exposing my children to a carcinogenic of that type? all day, 7 days a week, or 5 days a week, 7 hours a day? That's sort of like the question you need to ask yourself when you hear about Wi-Fi in the classroom. And by the way, it's only the thermal that was ever considered, not the biological. So we have others who begin publishing the plethora of research that we know about. The Bio Initiative is one group. And actually, Dr. Carpenter out of New York, Albany, I think he's out of, for 30 years has been writing about the impact of emissions to us. Dr. Blake, who was in Columbia, for years has been talking about electromagnetic radiation. He's been publishing in Bio Initiative. Dr. Ali Johansson out of Sweden has been writing pretty serious publications through Bio Initiative. So if you want to know more about it in detail, you really want to go visit their site, the Bio Initiative site. They do a pretty good job and have been for years and years and years. We also have other sources that talk about the plethora of impacts, and that's with Dr. Joel out of Berkeley. He's been an advocate for years, and actually is pretty instrumental in changing some of the legislative impacts in California with his work. But he's a wonderful source. He keeps current with all the research that's coming out throughout the world, does a very great job. And then, of course, Environmental Health Trust is Dr. Deborah Davis. I think she may be talking this week. She's been tirelessly working this subject for years and years, and she's actually put together a wonderful group of experts that are producing really solid work and representing us in legislative and public information. So you really want to go to these other sources if you're looking for more information. I like Dr. Powell. Because I'm a mechanical engineer, I wanted to know the breakdown of a cell. I didn't want to hear it break down because something happened. I wanted to know what the mechanics were. And when I spoke before about the calcium penetration, that was Dr. Powell's work. And what Dr. Powell's recently done is he tried to summarize all the data that was in the marketplace to try to understand really what it is that's really happening in our environment. And actually, one of the most significant, in my opinion, and sitting on top of his chart, is the impact of the brain. You have a cell phone that the manufacturer says can't be more than 3/8 to 1 inch from the head. I've never used a phone that way. It's like I use it right against my head. That's 1.6 watts per kilogram hitting your head. And so when you hear about brain cancers, or when you hear about emotional behaviors, ADHD, Alzheimer's, all of these illnesses have been linked to exposures that are excessive. These excessive body responses are impacting our environment and the way we live. I remember looking at some research a couple of years ago, and they said that cancer of the brain has declined in time over the last 10 years. That can't be true. So I went and looked at the data, and it was true on the average. The cancer rate for the brain actually declined. And I further looked at the data, and I found frontal lobe cancer has increased 2% over a 10-year period. On the average, it didn't go up. But guess what? The frontal lobe is where there's the most impact to the body from a cell phone. The frontal lobe is where the brain cancers occur. The frontal lobe is where the control of human emotions occur. So many of the body functions that are being impeded have been found to directly correlate to the exposure we get from our cell phones. And also funny they talk about cancers overall declining in time. And within the data, if you look at it, it says the link between smoking a cigarette and lung cancer has dropped by 50%. By 50% in 10 years. That's good. I stopped smoking many, many years ago. Most of us probably did. I'm not going to kill myself smoking a cigarette that has arsenic in it. So that was true. But it's also true at the same time period. There's been a 50% decline, I think, in the fertility of male and females. And so you go into a doctor's office and you have your laptop, your tablet, or your cell phone in your pocket, and you ask the doctor, how come we can't have babies? It's a direct link between the 25% I told you about before. We know for sure that's an exposure that occurs. And in fact, with this book my son and I wrote, we actually had the most prominent radiologist in the country. He was like the first radiologist in the country. A brilliant, brilliant man. And we were debating ionized versus non-ionized. And I said that you can actually influence the womb. You have a cell phone in your back pocket. How far do you think it is to the egg? Not very far. So you could have a 12-year-old girl that has mutated cells from her cell phone, and you won't know about it in 4, 5, 10 years, 15 years, depending on when she gets married. And I said there's a potential that that mutated cell can propagate into subtending generations. He scoffed at me. And then about 2 years later, after he read the book, he calls me up and he said, I just had a young woman in my office. She had a cell phone, a laptop attached at her hip. And she just had a baby, died almost immediately, had very weird cancers. And he said, this doesn't substantiate your claim, but it certainly gives you pause for trying to listen to this. Dr. Powell, he talked about it, and he says 3 generations from now, we don't have children. We won't be able to produce them because the exposures are such that they really do affect our ability to propagate. I don't believe that. He does. I believe in statistics. The question is how many girls are going to put a cell phone in their pocket and have mutated cells? How many guys are going to put it? Some will, not everyone. So I don't ascribe to that prediction. But if it was true that every child, male and female, put a cell phone in their pocket, there is a probability of influencing the eggs and the sperm. So where does this all go? I'm not sure. Hormonal. I was talking with some of you before. Turns out that electromagnetic radiation hypersensitivity, and we're going to talk about that in a minute more, is influencing the pituitary gland, controlling our hormones. Women are far more hormone-based than men. 80% of electric hypersensitive are women. And so all of a sudden we're seeing correlations of exposures that we haven't seen before. I hate the word oxidative stress. Oxidative stress is an imbalance of antioxidants in the body. I hate it because that doesn't characterize the impact of radiation in our bodies. And And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But most of the industry talks about oxidative stress. They think you can improve the antioxidant balance and you can get better. Absolutely farthest thing from the truth. It takes far more complex ways of treating those who are exposed with this than ever before. And I'm going to go into that a little bit. I basically caught most of what his points were. But Dr. Powell, again, I love the man because he's been so effective at becoming prominent with this subject matter when only 5 years ago it didn't exist. So I really do appreciate his work. Now I'm going to start going into the clinic, what we know about in the clinic. We actually are fortunate enough to deal with clinics. And we interact a little bit. I like to think we help them through some of the complexity by sharing what's going on with other clinics. And you see the oxidative stress. It's not oxidative stress. It's cell danger response. A cell's a cell. When you have an external toxin, like a volatile organic compound, and you get a headache, it's the same mechanics when you get a headache from exposure to a router. So what we know is Dr. Novo has been, over the last few years, sophisticatedly developing an understanding about our modern environment and the impacts to our bodies. And he's now talking about it in the context of a cell trying to protect itself, just like cells do. But it becomes predictable. You can have a cell that's not developing the right proteins to talk to the next cell. The impact of that could be the conductivity between the frontal lobe that's controlling the emotions. There's a lot of processes now that we're knowing in the clinics that I believe is best being established by cell danger response definitions. Blood-brain barrier leakage. Actually, that's sort of an important point, and I'm going to delve a little bit more in detail because this is sort of important to know. When I talked about the FCC standard, I talked about 1.6 watts per kilogram, 1.6 watts. Bluetooth is 0.3 watts. We know from research 0.1 watts, when the blood-brain barrier is down, can impact the cell, frontal lobe cell. 0.1 watts, over 15 times less power levels than a cell phone. So when you have a blood-brain barrier, which many of us do, especially over 20% of us play football. I got mine from hitting my head against the wall. But that blood-brain barrier that protects our bodies is actually impeded. It actually gets disrupted by electromagnetic radiation. And so when that happens, the influence to the cell, it's easier to get through the brain and have that biological impact. So when your blood-brain barrier is down, you're more exposed. I want to really talk about this. We know that when you're exposed, bugs, and I'll talk about this a little later too, bugs, the virus bacteria of the body, is a very important part of our immune system. And when we see leaky gut or imbalanced gut, you're more exposed to the potential dangers that electromagnetic radiation actually influences your body about. And in fact, Dr. Olli Johansson from Sweden, his study work shows that when you have a cell phone, a laptop, a tablet near you, your whole suppression system is depressed. What does that mean? The bugs are going to get you maybe a little bit more. It becomes more serious. But the big, most serious part about that, antibiotics become more resistive. As you increase the speed of your exposures, the rate of the speed of the RF signal coming to you, you actually increase the potential for resistance to antibiotics. That's a serious, serious problem. Very serious. Our own bodies, if they can't deal with the increased the growth of the bugs in our bodies, and by the way, there are 10 times more bugs in your body, in your stomach, than there are in cells of your body. It's really, really influential to how we respond to this environment. We know if you're sleeping at night, you may not be recovering, and of course that's when the body recovers, because there's been the circumventricular organ, the mast cell control, is being influenced by the cell phone. It is literally changing the way in which the nerve system responds to the repair of the mitochondrial function of the body. So, like you go into bed and you wake up, you're still tired, your body hasn't recovered, and it's because of the potential influences from a cell phone that you're using every day to the brainstem of the brain. Thyroid cancer. A couple of days ago, Yale had a research report they published, and it said that there is a direct link from a cell phone use to thyroid. You are like 3 times more likely to get cancer from a cell phone use if you're predisposed. That is, there's genetics that were playing in this case. And there was that link, again, amongst 1,000 others that shows those links. I'm not so worried, again, as I started with this, with the cell implications of breakdown to a cancerous state. I'm worried about how it's influencing the hormones. We know for sure the combination of Wi-Fi to the pineal gland that's controlling the hormone balance of the body and other parts of the body can be imbalanced, and then the body doesn't recover when you go into your sleep because the mitochondrial has been affected, and then what do you do? So leukemia, here are some of the kinds of known research links to the body and its response. Autism. Prenatal, it's literally, as we spoke about, a cell phone in a pocket. And if you have a woman in the first trimester and she has a phone in a pocket, there's a potential to influence with that child, even before it gets out of the womb. It's also true, by the way, that a couple of years ago, there was a research study done where they gave a bunch of women that were in their first trimester meters. And they said, go out into the world, measure the levels of RF in your environment, and then come back to me in a month or 3 months, and let's see what happened. Bottom line was, you are 3 times more likely in high exposures to have miscarriage in that trimester, in that study. So there's direct links. Is it statistical? No, but those kinds of things bother me because I think it's directionally important to know. How much more time do I have, do you know? Sarah? Good. Okay. Okay, cool. Thank you so much. Electrohypersensitivity. This is Ollie's message. He's dedicated his whole life, by the way, to electrohypersensitivity. He is, for the last 30 years, only worried about the impact and the quality of life of the human exposed to these emissions. He's done a wonderful job. In Europe, by the way, you can get sick leave because you're electric hypersensitive. You can't in the US. They don't even recognize it necessarily. But Ali has been leading this space. And if you're electromagnetic hypersensitive, you're also multiply chemically sensitive. So if you smell gas and you get bothered by it, that's not unusual. Yeah, we have time. Okay, hypersensitivity. I'm not going to go through this detail, but these are all the kinds of symptoms: fatigue, numbness. Funny about that. There was a guy came to us, and they often ask me if I have a cell phone, my hand's getting numb. Is it a problem or not? And I often point out that no one's died of cancer from electromagnetic radiation, even though you feel it in your hand. The hand is really pretty resilient. It doesn't have the soft tissue. It's when it goes towards the tissue, the womb, the heart, the head, those kinds of things are more susceptible than other parts of our body. So it bothers the crap out of you, but you're probably all right. This is sort of an important message. We have LEDs in our technology, all of these technologies we use around us. And if you see the call out of the blue light versus the UV light, believe it or not, that's where it goes from non-ionized radiation to ionized radiation. So we talked about the electron being knocked out of its orbit. That begins at the UV level. So blue light is right next to it. But boy, it's close, really, really close. And because of that, you got to start worrying about it, because particularly if your body becomes more sensitive, you're more responsive negatively to the exposures. So there's a lot of good reasons you use these LEDs, because the cost, the savings, the energy, but you have strain in your eyes. You have premature macular degeneration. You have dry eye. You have fatigue. And I remember I was talking to a physician, a pretty well-known guy, and he was telling me about his teammate that was working on a screen all day, and that he's been giving her drops in her eye because she had dry eye. And I said, well, what's the source? And he said, well, I don't know. I said, so what does she do? And he was telling me that her role in front of a screen all day. And it bothered me that he didn't know this, but I said, look, I'm going to send you blue light blocking glasses. I'm going to send you something that blocks that signal from getting to the eye. I did, and she had it on for 2 hours. Dry eye cleared up completely. Completely. For 10 years, she had her eyes were bloodshot. So here we are, I'm talking to a physician that really I had great respect for, and it was like going to a doctor saying, my head hurts. He gave her 2 aspirin. He never understood what her head was hurting about. And blue light is becoming important, not only because of its destructive nature, potentially, but there's also something else you need to worry about. And that's the trigger for you to sleep that's being disrupted. Blue light is hitting the back of the eye, and there's a protein, cryptochrome protein, that is the on and off switch to go to bed. It turns on the melatonin. So when you're looking at it, a tablet, and you decide to go to bed immediately, there's no melatonin. not triggered in to work because the switch wasn't turned on. So it really does disrupt. But is that all it does? No. Because now all of a sudden, you need to be in a circadian rhythm. You recover at night. All of that now being screwed up. Why? Because you looked at a screen before going to bed. So it's really a technology that we have that's really wonderful to have. But it also, we know for sure through research, impacts our bodies, and we have to be aware of what it does. So don't look at monitors before you go to bed. If so, make sure you use shield protection that prevents those signals from getting to the cryptochrome. In Italy, they went to court and they said, the use of my cell phone is directly connected to the frontal lobe cancer I got. They won. It went to appeal. Then it went to another appeal. They still won. And the appeals court said, we couldn't rely on what the service provider was saying. It didn't make sense to us. They clearly had a position. So we have a lot of Berkeley. When Berkeley went to say, hey, I want to put something on the outside of it, warning people to use, just like cigarette smoking. CTIA, which is a consortium for cell phone users, that was, I'm being distracted. He's making a lot of noise. Thank you. And so twice they went to appeals court, and they lost every time. So this is very good information to know because, in my opinion, when you have a groundswell of court, I quit smoking 35 years ago, 40 years ago. I know that we know the research knew it was a problem, but we didn't know. We only found out because they lost in court. So I see some of that happening now. And so there's more evidence. What can you do? I love this chart because all you got to remember is bees in the room. One bee won't kill you, 1,000 bees will. So when you are in a room, you have a cell phone on, you have the connection to the cell tower, the Wi-Fi transmission, and the Bluetooth. You have 3 bees in that one device. How many of those devices do you have on? All omnidirectionally feeding that room. So what you got to do is methodically go through your house and think about where these transmissions are. If you have a tablet, like for example, I have a tablet, I have an Ethernet connection. I don't have Wi-Fi. I don't need it. Most of the time I do my work there. So I manage my environment by considering where those bees are. I turn them off when I don't need them. So think about that. Where are the bees in the room? Turn them off. When you have a logarithmic drop-off of power levels when you go directly to your head and literally 4 feet away. It drops down to 90 to 99% power level drops by 4 foot. If you take it 1 to 2 foot away from your head, 80% of the dangers are gone. So this distance you are from your device is very important. What does that mean? When you take your laptop, your cell phone home, you put it one place where you're not sitting. Just put it away from you. The danger of that device goes away simply by moving it. If you are on and you're using it more than 6 minutes, don't go much more. You really want to be careful. When you're using it a short period of time, there is no danger. Don't panic. But if you're going to use it for an hour, use a wire line. Use a cable to it. Use it in your hands in the speaker. And then, of course, there's shielding. There are ways to prevent the omnidirectional signal going in a specific direction. So you want to look for devices that can be used. But you've heard throughout this time, gut, mineral balance, and cell health. More than ever before, you got to ensure these are in place because you're being exposed more and more to environments that are more and more dangerous to you. 5G, I have 7 minutes. Yes, please. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. You can do anything you want. You'll be able to talk to anybody you want. You'll be able to have your one device talk to your other device. There are amazing conversations about the value of having next generation devices. We started with 1G, obviously, we went to 5G. This is now, and by the way, we are demanding that as users. And so this is a next step to try to deal with that demand, and there's some questions we all have about it. But you have to ask the right questions, and that's what I hope to do. 5G is small cell towers like that. It's millimeter waves in certain parts of the network. It's beamforming in networks, and full dupe goes back and forth. You'll be able to send as much out as you get. It's massive MIMO, multiple in, multiple out. So there's technologies behind all of this that is enabling us to have the benefits of 5G. And so you'll be able to walk on the road. That will be able to connect to your refrigerator when you ask, where's the milk? Very important to know about this, and this is where it is sort of you need to pay attention to, because on the far left side we have 3G, 4G, roughly 9 meg to about 6 gigahertz. All those networks still exist over the foreseeable future. Next 10 years, most likely. Then you have low-frequency stuff. Basically, they call it 6 gig sub-network and below. Your TV with the antennas were 600 megahertz. It always existed, but the FCC now has allocated availability of that. And when you hear about Sprint, it's somewhere between 700 megs and 900. That's how they're giving you the service. It's not the millimeter stuff they're giving you. They're giving you stuff that existed for years and years and years. But it's separate from already a pre-existing network. Then you go, and there are other emissions at different levels that are up into the 10 gigahertz space. When you hear 5G is going to kill me, it's about the far right. It's the millimeter, 26 to 60 gigahertz. We can go up to 300 gigahertz, by the way, based on the FCC standard. But it's the stuff that's at the far right that is where the debates are, for the reasons I said. Okay, MIMO, multiple in, multiple out, and beaming. What this is 5G at the MIMO level, at the far end of the spectrum, at the small cell, is focused signals. They're omnidirectional, by the way, but there are 2 signals being sent. See the 2 red little beeper things? Those are antenna phase array transmissions. They actually can adjust, and when they adjust, they focus that power. See where they transition? They connect to each other, and you see that beam that comes out? That's controlling beam. That's MIMO. Remember the elephant I talked about? With 4G, they used 1 jackhammer. This is 2. They're focusing it in, and I created this image just so you can see that now focused beam is going to go to your head right through others, potentially. So we know that there's a high concentration of power that's never existed at a level of transmission that has never existed, and it's targeted specifically to your head. This is the concerns of 5G, not all that other stuff. So let's talk a little bit about that. Notice on the bottom left, see those little cell towers? That's because they can't go more than 850 feet. They have to be right in front of your house to be able to serve the back of your house. 850 feet at 23 gigahertz. That's a long way to go. And what's really somewhat interesting that no one realizes is that's at 20 watts. Remember, a cell phone is 1.6 watts? This is transmitting at 20 watts. A cell phone far out there, it's 60 watts. So it's a third of its transmission that's serving thousands and thousands of customers right at your front door at 20 watts. So all of a sudden, we're going to have a whole lot of stuff hitting our bodies like never before, and with beams focused to that. Bees. Those bees, by the way, are bees that were at a 5G site, and they died. We know 20 gigahertz through research, 20 gigahertz is absorbed 5 times more than 4G in a bee. If you went to a trial, if you looked at some studies up to 4G, and you put a transmitter inside a beehive, they wouldn't come back. Now we're 20 times higher and 5 times more absorption. Well, will that do? I don't know, because this is not statistical. I can't tell you what's going to happen, but I can tell you some cases it is. I already told you about the bacteria problem. We know at 20 gigahertz, we know for sure it accelerates the bacterium, the biome of the stomach, even more so than up to 4G at 2 gig. And the FCC has allowed us to go up to 300 gig. 6G is starting at above 300 gig. We know from research, Kylan and I wanted to, I went to school right here, and the protests are going on. Kylan's an expert in what happens to a signal when it hits your head, your body. She knows at 90 gigahertz, the spiral sweat glands of your body absorb as an antenna to your body. That's why these activation denial systems are so effective. They heat your body because it's a receptive, it modulates directly at the levels of a 90 gigahertz signal. So we know from some study work at some of the frequencies using that there is potentially danger to the user. And here's some examples of some of the news reports coming out in the marketplace. Some of the stuff we're seeing is we already know is happening, and so some of the claims being made by one side of is sort of coming to fruition, and you should know. So you need to decide if this is a problem for you. One thing's for sure, I can't control my son, I can't control my wife, I can't control my grandmother, I can't control my kids for sure. And their kids, I don't have any, because I invented technology to shield my son. I still don't have grandchildren. But you control your environment. You're the architect of your environment. You really need to think about what you can do to eliminate the bees in the room. Thank you.